I have finished gluing the top of the chassis to the bottom of the chassis. So now the entire tank is assembled. I went around the entire model, as I said I was going to do in the last segment, just looking for things that needed to be touched up and filling in any areas that just didn't look quite right, or redoing them. And I probably did that in probably well over 100 different areas. But while I was going around the entire vehicle, I noticed that there were some areas that had not been weathered, and they kind of just jumped right out. And I filled in all of them and chipped them up or rusted them out or whatever. But I left this one right here. I'm going to zoom in on it. And it's this area just above that little small box right there. There we go. And I'll put my fingernail here. It's right at the tip of my fingernail, right there. It's not even hardly, 3/8 of an inch high right in there. But if you look at that area, it's nice and clean. And what I found was anytime I found an area like that, it just jumped right out, and it looked unrealistic. Because if the rest of the tank is all chipped up and marred up and rusted and stained, why would that small area right there be so nice and clean? So by filling in all of those little tiny areas I had missed before, there are probably over like 30 of them on the top side of the tank here. It just makes everything look better as you're looking at the tank. You don't notice these areas and go, oh, that was a mistake. They didn't weather that area right there. So that was kind of lesson number one here at the end. The second thing I did was I went through and put a significant more of the pin wash onto the model. Both the oil-based pin wash that I told you how to make, but I also started using this panel line accent color, which is kind of like a pin wash in itself. And I found that if I wanted to do a kind of a brownish, greasy looking stain, oily stain, I would use the oil-based pin wash. If I just wanted to highlight an area or shadow an area, or make it look like there was some dirt or something around a bolt or something, I found this panel line accent color in black worked a little bit better. The third thing I did right here at the end was, after I had used those dusty pigments that I told you I had ordered online, the different colors, after I had used those on the tracks very effectively, and I found that they just blended together the different layers of rust and color that I put onto the tracks, I decided I would try doing that on the whole model. So what I did was I just took a tiny bit of the pigment there and would go around the tank and kind of just, work it into the little nooks and crannies, and even on just the open surfaces. And then I'll, blow away the excess pigment, and it just kind of blended everything together, and it kind of dirtied up the tank, kind of made the tank look a little bit dusty. I'm going to zoom in on these spikes right here, and you can just take a look at those spikes, and you can see some dust on there and like dirt, and it just really makes the whole tank kind of blend together by going over the tank with that pigment on a bristle brush and just rubbing it in to all the little nooks and crannies around the tank. I used it especially on these two cables that I had created out of fishing string, and before these were just painted black. And by using those pigments, you can see how much more realistic those cables look now. I brushed in some of the pigment on the handles to the wire cutters, and you can see how they look much better now as well. So, lesson I learned there is the dusty pigments that I had used on the tank tracks actually work good on the whole model. The other lessons that I learned were when I put those welds on the tank, I made a mistake of trying to chop them up too fine and adding in too much glue. And from a distance, you know, like way back here, you could hardly even tell it was a weld. I'm going to zoom in on this one weld, and you're going to be able to see the individual cuts that I made in that styrene rod. And zoomed in like this, and I'm going to show you just how much it's zooming in by putting my fingernail there. By zooming in that much, the weld doesn't look very realistic. But zooming out at the normal viewing distance, the weld looks much better than if I had tried to make it look more like a real weld at the zoomed in distance. So if it looks realistic getting this close in, it doesn't look realistic looking this far out. And this is how you view the model. You don't get your face right in there. You don't look at it with a magnifying glass. So don't over chop up and use too much glue dissolving that styrene rod on those welds. Another lesson I learned was after I had painted the tank the yellow-green color and was getting ready to start chipping it, I chipped out these engine covers first. And I was so pleased with the way they looked that I started just chipping up everything all over the tank. And I wound up over chipping. I think right now the tank is maybe just a little bit over chipped. There were some areas that I had scratched up so bad and chipped out so much that I just had to go back and repaint them and start over. I actually repainted every one of the engine covers because I had just taken too much paint off of every one of them because I just kept chipping away at them. So lesson is, don't go over chipping it once you start that process. The other lesson that I learned was when it came time to use these rust washes and to also use the pin washes that I made, dilute, dilute, dilute. I kept using too strong a mixture of these paint washes and paints that look like rust. And when I would put them on, they just didn't look realistic. And I found that by diluting them down, like 10 times more than what I initially did, I was able to come up with effects like this that really do, I think, look very realistic. But if you use it like right out of the bottle or only diluted 50-50, let's say, it just does not look as realistic when it does dry. The other lesson that I learned about these rust paints is there's a reason why when you buy a package of these, you get like 6 of them. It's because by layering in all of those different shades of rust, the dark rust, the orange rust, the light orange rust, it makes the rust look realistic. If you only use, let's say, 2 of those shades, it will not look near as realistic as if you use all 5 or 6 of them. And the various YouTube videos that I watched on that said that. I just didn't believe it. I just thought, why do you have to have so many different shades? It just doesn't make any sense, especially on something as small as these spikes. I mean, why do you need to have 5 different shades of rust on just one of those spikes? And the reason is it just looks much more realistic than if you only use 1 or 2 shades of rust. Same thing with everything else on the tank here that you see is rusted up. So layer, 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 layer when it comes to rust effects. That jack probably is maybe the best example of all those different rust shades being used at one time or another. And that jack did not look near as good as it looks now until I came back with some of that dusty pigment and just rubbed it in there real good and then brushed away the excess. It just blended everything together much better. Next lesson I learned was definitely weather up your tracks. I would say of the entire weathering process on the entire tank, the areas that came out the best and really look the most realistic are the tracks themselves. When you look at how those tracks look right out of the box, the black vinyl, and if you were to put those on the model and not weather them like was done here, quite a difference in this the way the whole model would look. I go back and look at some of the other tank models that I've done where I just use the black vinyl plastic tracks right out of the box, and it just almost looks ridiculous. So big lesson learned there on the weathering process is how important it is to weather the tank tracks themselves. The other lesson that I learned was that you will go over the tank after it's completely done. And when you first start, you'll just be so happy with the results. But as you get better and better at doing different areas, you'll come back to the areas you did first and you're not satisfied with it anymore. And so you can expect that in your first effort in weathering a tank model. Like when I was putting the rust on these bolts on the front armor here, that streaks of rust coming down the bolts. The first time I did that, I thought, wow, that just looks great. And then I kind of went and I did it to the, some bolts over here. And then when I came back to these bolts, I thought, wow, they don't look near as good as those other ones. And so I just had to repaint it and just start all over and redo it. Each one of those bolts right there is a combination of the chipping out that green paint, adding in that brown pin wash, adding in the black pin wash, that Panaline accent color, and adding in the rust effects. But I didn't know it took that much work until I experimented around other parts of the tank. So you can expect to come back and redo a lot of the areas that you thought just looked wonderful, but then later on you come back and you say, that doesn't look as good as the newer stuff that I've been working on concerning the tank. So that's about it. Just to wrap things up here, it's basically 5 steps. The first step is to put those welds on the tank. That will really help the tank look more weathered when you chip out those welds and put some rust on those welds and some stains on those welds. The chipping process is the second step, which I highly recommend to make it more realistic. The third step is going through every single bolt and cranny and line on the tank and using that pin wash. The fourth step is using the rust effects colors and learning how to effectively do those. You just kind of call it, rusting the tank out. And then the final step in weathering the tank, at least from the way I did it, is to use these pigments here, these dusty pigments. which of all the things, I think they are the things that make the tank look uh, weathered more than anything else as far as realism. And I almost didn't even order them, to tell you the truth. I couldn't figure out how they would. Watching the videos, I just say, I don't understand. You're rubbing dust in there. What does that do? And is that dust going to just get all over the place or what? But the dust stays put once you rub it in, so you don't have to worry about it. Like making your shelf or something all dusty, because it stays in place. But it really adds to the realism of the overall model, and I highly recommend that you go online and order those, and you can get them in small little jars and stuff too. I found price-wise, getting them in these big, huge plastic bags, which I will never use all of that pigment my entire life, but I found it was actually kind of almost cheaper to buy it in the big quantities there than the little tiny jars, but it comes in both ways. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and conclude the video. I know that this has been a long video compared to a lot of the other videos that I do, but I did want to, document it both for myself, but hopefully it'll give you some confidence, because quite honestly, this is the first model tank, first model of any type, that I have ever tried this weathering process. And I've heard about it, and I've seen models before that were, weathered. And I always admired, I always just thought, gosh, how can somebody be, so talented, But these techniques that I showed you, and the ones that you can learn more about by looking at the same videos I did on YouTube and other places, really make it pretty simple, to tell you the truth. I was just surprised at how easy it was to get the effects that you see on the tank here, compared to what the tank would look like if you just put it together like right out of the box and maybe did nothing but just, painted a certain color and maybe paint the road wheels and then just put the plastic tracks on there right out of the box. Just very realistic looking by weathering it. So it's going to be hard for me to ever build another model and not go to the trouble of weathering it. I'm going to close just real quick by just mentioning the fact that this Panzer III is a tank from World War II. It was designed in the mid-1930s, went into production in 1937, and was built from 1937 to 1943. The chassis of the tank was the most used chassis of any armored vehicle in World War II, because it was used on a lot of other tanks and guns that the Germans had. When it was first designed, it was considered state-of-the-art, and it was. And it was very successful in the first battles of World War II, such as in Poland and France and Tunisia. But as the war went on and the Allies developed better tanks, such as the KV-1 and T-34 in Russia, or the British Matilda II and the American M4 Sherman, this tank could not hold up against those. Those tanks could outshoot it from a longer distance. They had more powerful guns, and their armor was much better. They modified the Panzer III numerous times, putting thicker armor on it, bigger guns, but it just never, ever could match up to the newer tanks. So that's why Germany created the Tiger tank and the Panther tank and the Panzer IV. But the Panzer III certainly did its job at the beginning of the war. There were over 5,000 Panzer IIIs, and each one of them had a crew of 5. And a lot of those crew members lost their lives inside these tanks because it was extremely deadly place to be if someone was trying to kill you with an anti-tank gun or another tank got a good shot at you. Your survivability rate inside of that tank was almost non-existent if a round made it inside of the tank. So a pretty scary way to go into battle. A lot of people thought that the people that were inside tanks were nice and safe, and you know, boy, I don't want to be an infantryman out there in the open, but when you were attacked, it was very difficult to survive. And of course, many times the tanks caught on fire as well. And there were an awful lot of people that were killed by the Panzer IIIs. It was a very effective weapon. One of the more effective parts of the tank were the two machine guns. The one up on the turret there, next to the main gun, and the one down here. And against infantry, unopposed, there just wasn't much that anybody could do against a Panzer III that was overrunning a infantry unit. So incredible amount of destruction done to the Allies with the Panzer IIIs. After the Battle of Kursk in the summer of 1943, the Panzer III pretty much was taken out of frontline action. But up until that time, it was really the dominant tank on the battlefield in both numbers and effectiveness. It was mainly in the Battle of Leningrad and Moscow in the winter of 1942 and 1943 that the crews of these tanks suffered the most. And this tank kind of depicts that. This tank depicts a Panzer III that had completed its mission in the winter of 1941 and 42, and had successfully, survived the battles of Moscow and Leningrad, and was getting ready to move on for the Battle of Kursk. But due to that entire winter in Russia, it wound up coming out of that looking like this. Extremely weathered and chipped and scratched and rusted. So with that mention of the historical part of the Panzer III, I'll close this video and wish you the best of luck in your first attempt to weathering a model tank. And I encourage you to not be scared to attempt that. I think you'll be real pleased with the outcome that you will have.